Game development is a turbulent process. Things don't always work out the way developers expect them to, and often, games in their final form turn out to be very different from what they were originally envisioned as. Here, we're going to talk about those games that went through dramatic changes while they were under development and ended up delivering final products that deviated quite a bit from what they were originally intended to be. Metal Gear Solid 5: The Phantom Pain. An obvious first pick for a feature such as this one. There's no shortage of areas where Metal Gear Solid 5 ended up being drastically different from the game Hideo Kojima and his team had originally wanted to make. From the story's conclusion being effectively cut out, to several gameplay features being dropped, to the entire second half of the game being a remix of the first half due to time constraints, to several significant narrative changes being made even to some of the primary characters, the Metal Gear Solid 5 that we got was an almost unrecognizable game from what it could have been if things had gone to plan. Metal Gear Solid 2: Sons of Liberty. In the very early months of Metal Gear Solid 2's development, it was going to be a much different game, a much more traditional sequel to its predecessor in fact. The original plan was to have Solid Snake be the primary protagonist once again, with the story dealing with nuclear weapons, the return of Liquid Snake, the actual Liquid Snake, not just his arm, and Snake's attempt to foil his plans, to use Metal Gear once again. As we all know well enough now, that story changed drastically, and even though the tanker section in Metal Gear Solid 2 is essentially a holdover from the original vision, almost everything else ended up being thrown out the window. Final Fantasy XV. This one was also kind of an obvious pick. Development on the game began all the way back in 2016, when Tetsuya Nomura, directing what was back then still known as Final Fantasy Versus 13, years passed, and the game effectively entered development hell. People began losing hope that it would ever see the light of day. In 2013, it was re-revealed, only Square Enix had now rebranded it as Final Fantasy XV, and with that rebranding came major changes. Hajime Tabata took over as the game's director, and though some elements were retained, the actual game ended up being almost completely different from what Nomura's Versus 13 was going to be. Resident Evil 4. Resident Evil might be one of the most influential games of all time, but it took Capcom quite a while to land on that concept that would go on to be used as the foundation for the final game. Several development builds were scrapped or heavily altered, with one particular build, now famously referred to as Resident Evil 3.5, being set in a castle and featuring everything from hallucinations to a terrifying new foe known as Hookman. It was only when series creator Shinji Mikami took control of the project and restarted development from scratch that the final concept of the game crystallized properly. The rest, of course, is history. Resident Evil 2, 1998. Similar to Resident Evil 4, the original RE2 also had to go through some redesigns in its early development stages. Under Hideki Kamiya, the original vision for the game was originally quite different. And that earlier build, which is now known as Resident Evil 1.5, had everything from a completely different protagonist alongside Leon to different environments and gameplay mechanics that never made it into the final product, such as being able to equip defensive gear. The game was, in fact, about 60 to 80% done when it was scrapped, because Shinji Mikami, who was still overseeing the project, wasn't satisfied with how it was turning out. Of course, in retrospect, that was probably for the best, because the Resident Evil 2 we ended up getting is one of the best horror games ever made to this day. Red Dead Revolver. Red Dead Revolver is the black sheep of the Red Dead series, to the extent that many often forget that it even exists. But at least the story of its development is an interesting one. Following Angel Studios' collaboration with Capcom on the N64 version of Resident Evil 2, the developer was tapped by the Japanese company to make a Western-themed spiritual successor to the arcade shooter Gunsmoke. Development ran into issues almost immediately though, and by 2003, Capcom canceled the game. By that time, however, Angel Studios had been acquired by Take-Two Interactive and moved under the Rockstar label, who went on to purchase the Red Dead Revolver property, thus allowing the developer to finish making the game on their own terms. Conker's Bad Fur Day. Originally announced as Conker's Quest, Conker's Bad Fur Day was, in its early development stages, envisioned as a kid-friendly 3D platformer inspired by Super Mario 64, with a cute squirrel mascot character serving as the protagonist. And sure, that squirrel mascot would remain in that role in the final product as well, but in a very different capacity. Rare completely changed tracks partway through development, throwing out the idea of developing a pleasant, charming, child-friendly platformer, and instead ended up making an edgy game with mature tones, satirical humor, parodies of popular pop culture names, and more. In retrospect, Conker hasn't exactly aged too well, but one can't help but marvel at how drastically the final game differs from what Rare originally intended it to be. Uncharted Drake's Fortune. In today's day and age, Uncharted is a dynasty unto itself, but even though it is one of the biggest gaming properties in the world right now, back when it first made its debut, it was instantly dubbed by many as yet another Gears of War clone. And you know what? In many ways, that's exactly what it was, as revealed by former Naughty Dog developer Lucas Pope in an interview with Ars Technica a couple of years ago. Uncharted originally didn't have cover shooting mechanics. Gears of War launched in 2006 and took the industry by storm. Naughty Dog was one of many developers to follow in its footsteps, and retooled the entire game and turned it into a cover shooter just 6 months before launch. Uncharted 4: A Thief's End. Looking at Uncharted 4 now, it's hard to believe that it suffered probably one of the most tumultuous development cycles in Naughty Dog's history. Originally still being led by series creator Amy Hennig, Uncharted 4 was envisioned as a very different game, with a story that differed from what the game ended up being in many crucial ways, like the fact that Sam Drake was originally going to be the antagonist. After Hennig's departure, Uncharted 4's development had to be rebooted. The Last of Us duo Neil Druckmann and Bruce Straley had to be brought in to steady the ship, and a huge chunk of the work ended up being thrown out, with the game's story in particular seeing some drastic changes. Of course, given how excellent Uncharted 4 is, those changes probably worked out for the best. Halo: Combat Evolved. Halo Combat Evolved completely revolutionized the industry when it first launched in 2001, to the extent that it wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that, if not for that game, first-person shooters as we know them today simply wouldn't exist, especially on consoles. Funnily enough, though, it wasn't even a first-person shooter for a significant chunk of its development cycle. Bungie was initially developing Halo as an RTS. Sometime later, they changed gears and turned it into a third-person shooter, even planning on including open-world elements. Of course, a couple of years later, Bungie was acquired by Microsoft and tasked with releasing Halo just a year later as a launch title for the original Xbox, and in the span of a single year, they reimagined it as a first-person shooter, conceptualized all of its mechanics and how it would control on a gamepad, and finished development on what would go on to become one of the greatest games ever made. Mass Effect: Andromeda. If BioWare had been able to make the Mass Effect Andromeda they had originally wanted to make, it could have been one of their best games ever. They had no shortage of excellent ideas, from using procedural generation in conjunction with a focus on exploration to allow players to discover new and fantastic sights in an unfamiliar galaxy, to having multiple new alien races, to making the first contact with said alien races as integral parts of not just the story, but also the gameplay. That Mass Effect Andromeda could have been one hell of a game. Of course, the game's development was an absolute mess, and most of the good ideas ended up being cut out. What we got instead was a significantly less ambitious and deeply flawed game that failed to live up to the high standards set by its predecessors. Destiny. Of the games Bungie have released in the last few decades, there have been very few, if any, that didn't have catastrophic development cycles. But arguably few got as bad as Destiny's development cycle did, where there was such a disconnect about what the game was even supposed to be among the leads that it didn't even take shape until just a year or so before release. In fact, it wasn't just that the dev team was unaware of what they wanted the game to be, it was that they were all disconnected from not just the conception of the game, but from each other. Everyone had a different idea of what Destiny should be. Egos clashed, work got wasted, and in the end, almost everything in terms of the game's story got thrown out just a year before it was due out, with a new story being commissioned and existing work being hastily retrofit into what the new story was planned to be. Have you ever wondered why Destiny, the game that launched, was so different from Destiny, the game that had been originally promised? Have you ever wondered why Bungie barely seemed to have a handle on what they wanted Destiny to be until after The Taken King came out, 1 year after the base game had released? Well, you know why now. Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance. This is a bit of a running theme, isn't it? A Metal Gear title begins development, faces some hurdles, and then ends up completely reinventing itself. Konami and Kojima Productions first introduced the game as Metal Gear Solid Rising, promising a new breed of stealth action gameplay with a story that would fill out the gaps in the series' canon, but development troubles meant that both from a narrative and gameplay standpoint, the project never got to where the development team wanted to take it. Eventually, they turned to Platinum Games for help, and though they did, of course, end up delivering a stellar action title, Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance differed from the game's original vision in crucial, fundamental ways. Of course, given how good Rising was, no one can ever complain about how it turned out, but we can't help but wonder often about what the game would have been like if Kojima Productions had been able to make the game they had initially wanted to make. Star Fox Adventures. Like Metroid Prime, Star Fox Adventures was a radical reinvention of a beloved Nintendo franchise, and like Metroid Prime, it was originally supposed to be something else entirely. The game was originally being developed by Rare for the N64 as Dinosaur Planet, a new IP that would focus on anthropomorphized dinosaurs as the primary characters. And once again, it was Shigeru Miyamoto who proved instrumental in the project's reinvention, who convinced Rare that the concept that they were working on wouldn't require too many drastic changes to be turned into a Star Fox game. The final result may not have been as revolutionary as Metroid Prime, but once again, Miyamoto was right on the money with his assertion. Super Mario Bros. 2. At this point, it's one of the most well-known gaming legends there is. Super Mario Bros. 2, as we know it, was never a Mario game at all. The original Super Mario Bros. Breakout success prompted Nintendo to commission a sequel, and the developers over in Japan came up with one, which wasn't the ideal follow-up to the original, let's say that. It was designed to be freakishly difficult and positively hostile to players, and not in the way that something like Dark Souls is, but in a way where the game was outright unfair. Nintendo of America took one look at that game and realized that releasing that as Mario 2 could sabotage the burgeoning brand that they had built their success off the back of. And so they decided to take charge of the situation, taking a Japan-only side-scrolling platformer called Yumi Kojo Doki Doki Panic, also developed by Mario creator Shigeru Miyamoto, amusingly enough. Unlike the real Mario 2, they decided to reskin it with Mario characters and release that as Super Mario Bros. 2. The rest is history. Super Mario Bros. 2 was a huge success, with indelible impacts on the series. It introduced several new enemy types that remain mainstays of the franchise, and it added unique controls and characteristics for its characters that remain a part of the series to this day, such as Luigi being taller and having a higher jump but less traction, and it remains one of the few Mario platformers to have Princess Peach as a playable character. The actual Mario Bros. 2 would eventually release in the West in subsequent anthology releases as The Lost Levels, but honestly, that's not nearly as good of a game. Nintendo made the right call here. Metroid Prime. Metroid Prime is one of the highest-rated games of all time. It was a stunning achievement of technology and game design, and funnily enough, it wasn't even a Metroid game to begin with. Developers Retro Studios were working on a first-person shooter, but as the legend goes, they ran into a lot of trouble trying to make progress on that project. During a visit from Nintendo's Shigeru Miyamoto, all of their projects got cancelled and thrown out, all except the first-person shooter. Miyamoto felt that game could be retooled into Metroid, you see, so it ended up being overhauled and turned into the game that would eventually become Metroid Prime. It's amazing how arguably the most iconic Metroid game didn't even start life as one. And that brings us to the end of the video. A quick request, we upload new videos every single day, and if you like what we're doing, please consider subscribing. It really helps us out. Also, don't forget to enable all notifications by clicking the bell icon so that you can receive daily video updates. Thanks for watching.